Is critical race theory being taught in American schools? It's January 2022, and Americans are divided. Let's first dive deeper into the issue.
An overflow crowd, parents giving Forsyth County School Board members an earful.
If you have materials that you're providing where it says if you were born a white male, you were born an oppressor, you are abusing our children.
One speaker after another accused board members of introducing so-called critical race theory about whites, blacks, and U.S. history into the classrooms. Parents saying that CRT is now indoctrinating students, disguised in the school system's initiatives on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI.
The DEI program is a Trojan horse that will bring in a slippery slope. A slippery slope that will ultimately end in critical race theory, white repentance, and the McDonaldization of America's students.
Please get back to just teaching our children math, science, factual history, equity of opportunity, and teaching them how to think and not what to think.
But other parents and some students said that's not what's going on in the classrooms at all.
My guest today is Jennifer Ho, the daughter of a refugee father from China and an immigrant mother from Jamaica, whose parents themselves were immigrants from Hong Kong. Professor Ho is the director of the Center for Humanities and the Arts and professor of ethnic studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. She teaches courses on critical race theory and Asian American culture. In this episode, we define what critical race theory is, how transparent schools should be with parents about the curriculum they teach, whether school board protest meetings are justified, if college campuses and academia have a left-leaning bias, and more. Whether you agree or disagree with today's guest, I invite you to join with an open mind as we work to heal the division on critical race theory concerns in American education. Professor Ho, thanks for joining me today. Let's start with an introduction. Who are you and why are you joining the podcast today?
Hi, thanks for that, Kevin. So my name is Jennifer Ho, and I'm a professor of ethnic studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. I also direct the Center for Humanities and the Arts, and I'm currently the president of the Association for Asian American Studies. But I think the reason you're interested in talking to me is that I teach critical race theory, and I'm a critical race scholar.
So on the note of critical race scholar, can you touch on why you're uniquely qualified to be having this discussion today?
Well, I think if we're talking about critical race theory, as somebody who has been immersed in reading the literature, writing articles and scholarship that use critical race theory and teaching graduate level classes in critical race theory for over 2 decades, I probably know what I'm talking about, I guess I would say.
All right, well, let's start from the top. Define critical race theory for me.
So critical race theory is a discipline. It is a field of study that has been around since the late 1970s that emerged out of critical legal studies. In a nutshell, critical race theory believes that systemic racism that has been institutionalized has undergirded the history of the United States in terms of its laws and policies, and that we are feeling the effects of those early policies and continuing legacies of systemic racism to this day. And that critical race theory wants to investigate, first and foremost, through the law, how citizens and people in the US have been understood through the lens of race and racialization, and the ways that various harms have happened to people through these legal mechanisms. Essentially, critical race theory is the study of how race and racism have impacted people in the US.
You described to me that saying that critical race theory is being taught in K through 12 classrooms is like saying that your 7th grader is learning electrical engineering. Can you say more about this?
So critical race theory as a discipline is most often taught, and I would say almost entirely taught, as a graduate seminar. You may be able to find a critical race theory class being offered at the undergraduate level on college and university campuses. I'm not aware that critical race theory is being taught in K through 12 classrooms. It's possible that it is. I'm not ruling it out. I've just not heard of it. And my guess is that if critical race theory were being taught in a K through 12 classroom, it would be at the high school level, and it would probably be an independent high school that was offering it as an elective rather than as a requirement. And the reason it would be only taught as a high school senior elective is that the readings, so the people who write critical race theory are writing it towards a very specialized audience. So in other words, when I write pieces that are not meant for a general audience, but are meant for an academic audience on critical race theory, it's really dense theory. It's meant, I'm writing for other scholars. I'm not writing for a general audience. And so, when you have someone like Ian Haney Lopez, who's written White by Law, I'm not saying that an average reader couldn't pick up Ian Haney Lopez, but you'd have to really come into it with some kind of an awareness of constitutional law, some kind of awareness of kind of the basics of US history. And it's fairly full of jargon, like any other technical field. That's why I said, like electrical engineering, a seventh grader is probably doing experiments with electricity, maybe learning about electricity. They're not being taught electrical engineering. And so very similarly, a student who's a seventh grader could be learning about the history of race and racism in the United States, but they're not being taught entrance convergence theory. They're not being assigned Kimberly Crenshaw. They're not learning about intersectional theory because it's a highly specialized field.
A lot of the divisiveness that we're seeing today is fears that this is being directly applied in the K through 12 level. So why do you think that is? And what do you think are the most common misconceptions leading to this?
Sure. So I'm glad you're asking that question because there's actually an answer. And that answer has to do with a New Yorker article written about Christopher Rufo, R-U-F-O. So Christopher Rufo wants credit for creating the moral panic over critical race theory and doing so out of a desire for interfering in electoral politics. And I want to be really clear about that he had in mind an idea to gain Republican voters. In the summer of 2020, he was interviewed on Fox News. And a few months prior to that interview on Fox News, he had stumbled across the field of critical race theory. And in learning more about critical race theory through the cursory way that he was learning, not taking a course, but, doing some reading, he realized that there were critics. So let's say there's Kimberly Crenshaw, who cites a theorist, let's say Michel Foucault, who's a French philosopher, and Michel Foucault cites Karl Marx. We have one critic who's writing an article who is citing another critic, Michel Foucault, who, by the way, is dead, who then cites another philosopher, Karl Marx. So by 3 degrees of separation, you get to Marx. So Rufo thinks, aha, this is a field founded by Marxism, right? Critical race theory is founded out of Marxist principles. And so therefore, it's a short jump from Marxism to communism and socialism, which means you get to invoke the Red Scare of the McCarthy era. Rufo goes on Fox News and he basically says, look, there are these diversity trainings. They're really terrible. Critical race theory is infecting the federal government through these diversity trainings. President Trump hears him say that, gets his aides to talk to him. And the next thing you know, in early September, you have a federal ban on the teaching of critical race theory. And they're basically being tied to diversity trainings. President Trump loses the election. I believe that, by the way. I believe that he lost the election. And those executive orders are repealed. So there were temporarily these executive orders preventing the teaching of critical race theory, preventing diversity training from being held at the federal level. In January, after the swearing in of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, you then saw that critical race theory was once again being taken up, and this time applied to K through 12 school districts. And so there is an article that was written that traces the path from Christopher Rufo to the Koch brothers, and that the Koch brothers saw the success of the anti-critical race theory rhetoric and thought that by applying it to the K through 12 school district, right, which you get through diversity. So critical race theory is now being used in an umbrella way to talk about anything related to race and racism or diversity training. And so then you have parents and I should say largely white parents, probably not all white parents, but largely white parents in largely middle class and upper middle class school districts, believing that there is something called critical race theory that's being taught that is making their children feel uncomfortable or teaching them to hate themselves. That is one of the charges about critical race theory, is that it's teaching white students to feel bad about being white. And so even though people like me have said, look, there is no way that any reasonable high school history teacher is actually assigning Michael Omi and Howard Winant's racial formation in the United States, because it's way too dense. It's quite frankly, it is not appropriate to be assigning that based on reading level. It's not an appropriate text to assign to a high school classroom. I mean, I'm sure there are some seniors that could handle it. There's some very brilliant high school students out there in the world. So I'm not trying to cast aspersion on high school reading levels, but it's very dense. And again, if we're talking about what is typically taught, it's not even typically taught at the undergraduate level. It's really graduate level material. It doesn't matter what critical race theory actually is. What matters is the way that it got spun into being communist propaganda. That's really the sticking issue. Critical race theory is communism. Communism is bad. Therefore, critical race theory should not be in our school districts.
With that, I want to use a news clip to segue into my next question.
I believe parents should be in charge of their kids' education.
Mr. McCullough, 30 seconds.
So first of all, this shows how clueless Glenn Youngkin is. He doesn't understand what the laws were because he's never been involved here in helping Virginia. But it was not. The parents had to write to veto books, Glenn, not to be knowledgeable about it, also take them off the shelves. And I'm not going to let parents come into schools and actually take books out and make their own decision.
You vetoed it.
So, yeah, I stopped the bill that I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach.
While you teach at university, I still think the question applies. Do you think parents should have an influence on determining what's taught to their children?
Well, I guess I would say maybe, but I think also we have to break down what's underneath that question. Should parents have an influence in what their children are being taught? I mean, certainly they must be having an influence in the home. One would hope that they are having an influence in the home. The other thing is that when we say parents, which parents are we talking about? So in other words, if I, as an Asian American parent, want to influence what my children are reading and believe that what they're not getting is Asian American history, is it then appropriate for me to say, I want all students to be reading Asian American history? Maybe, but I'm guessing most people would see that as me imposing a very fine agenda onto an entire school district. And that some people would say, what right do I have as a single Asian American parent to say that I want to influence a school district in what my child is reading? Now, maybe that would be more appropriate if Asian American students made up a majority, but that's also implying that somehow only Asian American students would benefit from reading Asian American history. When I would make the argument that I think all students, regardless of what their identity is, would benefit from reading about Asian American history. Should parents have a say in their child's education? Yes, in terms of their home life, maybe in terms of the school district, because who are we talking about when we talk about parents? And what do we mean when we say influence? Influence as in collaborate with schools, create conditions for schools to be able to make each student feel like they're seen? Sure. But influence as in, I don't agree with this particular curriculum, and therefore I want my voice to be heard over the voices of others. Then I think we have a problem. So in other words, what are has anyone asked Black parents what they think about critical race theory? I've seen a lot of news pieces, and I haven't seen any news pieces that have asked Black parents what they have to do to educate their children to be safe.
Well, then let's dive into the next clip.
Who pays your salary? Shame on you.
What had been planned as a typical school board meeting in Virginia's wealthy Loudoun County this week devolved into pandemonium. Shame on you! Shame on you! With hundreds of parents flooding an auditorium to accuse the school system of teaching their kids that racism in America is structural and systemic, something the school board denies is part of the curriculum. Things got so heated that the board members eventually walked out, leaving the police to deal with the unruly crowd. 2 people left in handcuffs.
This is an unlawful arrest. I have a First Amendment right.
Loudoun County School Board has been roiled for months by accusations that it has embraced critical race theory.
What responsibility do educators and school boards have to help mitigate concerns from parents regarding this issue?
I mean, I think that we all have a responsibility to try and, I guess, first take the temperature down, right? I mean, that's kind of one of my first thoughts, is that that's just a scene of chaos. Why are we having adults yell at each other? Also, I think there's a lot of bad faith. There's a lot of assumption of bad faith going around. So there's an assumption about what's happening in K through 12 districts. And, if anybody actually saw what teachers get paid, I think, like I heard somebody say, like, we pay your salary. Okay, you're really paying a very low salary then, right? Like, school teachers do not get paid nearly what people might think they do. Several, especially in the public schools, but even independent schools, right? Very common for school teachers to have to take on second jobs and definitely to work over the summer. So let's just start there. We're not talking about really highly paid people. We're talking about people who really entered into this profession because they care. But let's take this question seriously, right? Do educators have a responsibility to address concerns in the community? Of course. But I think educators also have a responsibility to emphasize the things that education is supposed to emphasize, which is to say, good critical thinking skills, and also good citizenship skills. So in other words, is it actually good citizenship for people to be screaming at each other during a public meeting? I would say no. I would say that what I'm seeing in that clip, what I'm hearing, because I realize this is a podcast, so people can't see the pandemonium, are a lot of people who are angry and yelling, and not a whole lot of listening is going on. And so, yes, you may have a concern about what's being taught. I guess I would say a couple of things also. Why is it a problem to talk about systemic racism? Because systemic racism is simply a reality. It's not pointing fingers. To say that systemic racism exists is also to say that we're a capitalist nation. So people might have feelings about the United States being a capitalist nation, but anyone who has a credit card, anyone who is listening to this podcast is participating in a capitalist nation. There are very few people who are able to live off the grid and completely sustain themselves without engaging in an exchange of money and goods. And so very similarly, we are living in a society in which systemic racism exists. You can say that it doesn't, but that doesn't negate the fact that systemic racism is what allowed for settler colonialism. It's what allowed for European settlers to come here and take and steal and buy land from indigenous people. It's also what led Europeans to take people from Africa, decide that they were Black, create the system of race and racism, decide that they were Black, and take them to an entirely different continent to work as enslaved labor. That's simply a reality. And that was institutionalized. It was systemic. It wasn't like one person deciding that they were going to enslave 20 people and then bring them over, and it's a one-off. There was an entire system, an entire economic system in the US South that was created out of the transatlantic slave trade and the enslavement of people from Africa who were labeled Black. That is simply a reality. And here's the thing I would say, Kevin. The people who are saying we don't want critical race theory in our schools, we don't want our children to feel bad about themselves, this didn't happen, are people who really are not giving enough credit to the United States and to the people in the United States. In other words, do we really believe that the US is so fragile that it can't handle criticism? Do we really think that the United States has to have a perfect history, as if there's a single human being that is perfect? Human beings are deeply flawed. We are deeply, deeply flawed people. And we try, right? We try to do better. We try and learn from our mistakes. And in a really similar way, I think that is what the project of the United States is trying to do. The project of the United States sounds really great on paper, that it's going to create a democracy, that it's going to be for all people. But in the execution of it, it hasn't lived up to that promise. The American dream has not been the American dream for all people. It certainly hasn't been true for women, as just one example, right? So why can't we just say that? Why can't we just admit, yeah, it has been a very imperfect nation, and it's made lots and lots of mistakes, and it is trying to learn. I think the United States, my most generous read is that the US is trying to learn, and critical race theory was developed actually as a mechanism, as a field of study, to try and get the United States to learn from its mistakes and do better. And if we think about the United States as a child, isn't that what we want children to do? We don't want children to grow up thinking that everything they do is perfect. That's not going to create good human beings. What we want, if you really love something, if you really care about something, you want your children to learn from mistakes and grow and be better people. And I think that's what's true also of the US. And I think that's what critical race theory does.
What social institutions and systems do you see as the largest embodiments of racism, and how do you define this?
I mean, everything in some ways is embodying of race and racism. So here's the thing. Race and racism are best understood as two sides of the same coin. So the reason that we have racial categories is that the system of racism, the system of deciding that people could be categorized through the body, through shapes of eyes, texture of hair, skin color. Although let me just say, skin color is actually a very imperfect way of deciding race. You know, especially if you look at somebody who's South Asian, whose skin may be very dark, but they're not going to be classified as Black, although actually, interestingly, at one point they were, but that's another digression. So in other words, optics on the body are just one way that we understand race. We understand race coded multiple different ways, but we needed to have a system of race in order to have a system of racism, that they're deeply interconnected. So there is no institution that we have created as humans in the United States that's devoid of thinking about race, which therefore means that any time we are invoking race, we are also invoking this shadow of racism and racial hierarchy. And I think we're trying really hard, right? This is one of the conundrums of, I would say, anti-racism work. If we recognize that race is deeply intertwined with racism, then how do we continue to use a language of race in order to undermine a language of racism? It's in some ways paradoxical. And so that's why I'm saying it's really kind of everywhere, not because I think that there is one institution that's more racist than another. And by the way, the way that I also think about it in its adjectival form, I'm an Asian American woman. I'm looking at you, and I think I would say optically you look to be a white man. I actually have no idea how you identify, but optically I would say you look to be a white man. Now, some people would say because you're a white man, you're automatically racist. And because I'm not a white man, I'm not racist. What I would say is that both of us can be people who say and do racist things. And I would guess that both of us are people who have said and done racist things at some time in our life. But that also means that both of us can be people who say and do anti-racist things. That in other words, racism is best understood as a system. It's best understood as the things that people say and do and the values that you hold as an ideology, which then means it's not an identity category. So if it's not an identity category, then that means that any one of us can embrace the opposite. And that's another thing that puzzles me about the people who are saying like, we don't want critical race theory in our schools. If we kind of break it down and think, okay, if critical race theory is saying, as I'm saying, that the United States was founded out of racist principles, and let me tell you, the 3/5 compromise is definitely one to unpack if we're going to unpack the way that racism is implicated in the foundational documents of the United States. Then I'm also saying that it's possible for any of us to really critique that and to say we can actually try and undo the kind of harms that have been made in the name of race and racism, which means that actually critical race theory, if it were being applied in K through 12 school districts, would be a tool of liberation. it would actually mean real freedom for people to be able to say, here is a way out. Here's a way out of the racism of the past into a present and future that's actually trying to do better by the next generation.
So I want to transition to your experience as a tenured university professor. From your own students, from your own faculty, what's the most common criticism you receive regarding what you teach?
Well, that's interesting. I'm not sure that I have fellow faculties who critique what I teach. I mean, I've had some faculty in my previous institution who would say there weren't enough Asian American students to justify me teaching Asian American studies, which again is a very misguided notion of who benefits from Asian American studies. In terms of my students, I mean, I teach courses where it's really clear what it is I'm teaching. So for example, I'm teaching a first-year seminar right now at University of Colorado Boulder called Mixed Race America. It's not going to be a mystery, the orientation that I'm going to take. I mean, I think the students might say that I am biased, right? I think that's maybe one charge that they might make, but that's more personal. That's not about the class, right? So there are some people who would say like, oh, I think that Professor Ho, even though she's trying to be objective, is actually really biased and believes X, Y, and Z. And I think that's probably true in the sense that I do believe in the things that I'm teaching. So in other words, the charge of bias is only going to stick if you somehow think that my talking about and teaching about race and racism has another point of view. So in other words, so is it biased to talk about race and racism? I would say no, I'm talking about race and racism objectively, as I understand it, through a lens of critical race studies. But if you think there's another side to talk about race and racism, then you're going to perceive that what I'm teaching is biased because I'm not providing the other perspective. But I have to be honest with you, Kevin, I'm not exactly sure what the other perspective on race and racism is, right? So in other words, let's take again the transatlantic slave trade. What is the other perspective of the transatlantic slave trade? That it was justified to enslave people, to kidnap them and make them work for free on a plantation in another continent? I have a hard time thinking that I haven't read the other side, right? Like, in other words, is there a scholarly argument to be made that is pro enslavement of people? I don't know it. It's like, one of the school districts in Texas said, we've got to teach both sides to the Holocaust. I don't know that anyone's going to make a pro-genocide argument, right? We're talking about genocide. We're talking about wiping out people in a really horrific, atrocious way. Is there really another side to talking about that? And I got to tell you, like, it's really minor. So in other words, in the entire time that I've been teaching, I mean, maybe 10 students. I've been teaching for over 2 decades. Maybe I can talk about 10 students because students self-select into my classes. They know what they're getting.
So expanding on this, you mentioned the oppressed and the oppressor. So it sounds like you haven't received feedback from students that this is something that they've felt when taking your classes.
That they're being oppressed by me?
That either you're making them feel as if they're an oppressed or an oppressor.
No, I mean, they may think that, but I haven't heard that.
So we're still focused on the university element of this conversation here. So I want to use another video clip to segue into a question.
Based on the best evidence, fewer than 1 in 10 professors hold conservative social, political, moral, or economic views. Although college professors are overwhelmingly on the left, there are big differences in the political values of faculty depending on their field. Dan Klein, a professor of economics at George Mason University, and his colleagues conducted an in-depth study of 6 academic disciplines: anthropology, economics, history, philosophy, political science, and sociology. Within these fields, faculty backed the Democratic candidate over Republican candidates by a ratio of 15-1. The left's advantage was most lopsided in anthropology and sociology, where Democratic faculty voters outnumbered Republican voters by approximately 30-1. In political science, faculty support for the Democrats over Republicans runs only 7-1. And in economics, the ratio is a mere 3-1. On the surface, then, it certainly appears that the odds are stacked against college students receiving anything but a left-wing indoctrination.
Do you think that college universities have a liberal bias? And do you think this is contributing to fears that CRT has become some sort of political ideology or indoctrination method?
So let's really unpack that clip. First of all, it's making a certain assumption. It's making an assumption that people who vote Democrat are left-leaning liberals. I'm not a left-leaning liberal. I know that's going to surprise some people. Like I don't actually, I would say the category that may best describe me is progressive. And I suppose left-leaning or left of center is also another accurate way to describe how I vote or my values. But I'm not sure that every single person who votes Democrat would say that they were a left-leaning liberal or interested in indoctrinating students. And I guess, so let's also start there. Anyone who is a college professor knows the quickest way to get somebody who is a 20-something-year-old person to disagree with you is to tell them, here's what I think you should believe. So in other words, if I was inclined, which I'm not, to tell students, you should vote the way that I vote, and here's who I'm voting for, I'm positive that a fair number, at least a third to a half, might very well actually vote in the opposite way because they don't want to be told what to do or what to think. So this is just, for people who have been to college or teach in the college, I think they know this, right? College students are not sheep who listen to their professors and who get indoctrinated into a particular worldview. I have seen these similar studies and this hand wringing of like, look at all these left-leaning Democrat voting professors. But instead of thinking about it as a problem of imbalance, how about we ask this question? Why is it that it seems like people who are involved in higher education are voting Democrat or who are holding left of center values? So is anyone asking that question? If we're asking that, and it might be because one of the things that I'm centrally interested in is critical thinking, is applying critical thinking skills and teaching my students to be able to look at sources and say, this is a good peer-reviewed source that has been written by somebody who is engaging in good scholarly practices of citing reputable sources, and then having their own scholarship reviewed as objectively as possible, usually in a double-blind way by other scholars, right? That's the best practice of peer review. Regardless of what discipline you're in, whether you're talking about the STEM disciplines or the humanities or the arts, that's the best practice of scholarship. And it can be that in doing that work, in those of us who have gone through higher education and gotten master's degrees and gotten PhDs, that we have learned these skills of critical thinking and thinking about peer review processes. And in that case, what we may be doing is using our critical thinking skills in the voter booth, in thinking about how we want to vote politically. And so it might be that in trying to look at critical thinking practices, best practices, you end up with people who are going to skew left of center, which means vote for the Democratic candidate. Because unfortunately, in the United States, we have a two-party system. Because honestly, I would prefer in more cases not to vote necessarily for the Democratic candidate, but the Democratic candidate is going to be aligned with my values more than the Republican candidate. So I'll just share like a short anecdote. So I was teaching a course at UNC Chapel Hill, again called Mixed Race America, and I had a conservative student, white male student, who said he was taking the course to be a conservative gadfly. And indeed, he would say things that I think most people would think were either shocking or disturbing or meant to provoke his fellow students. He was free to make these comments and students were free to respond to him. And I, for the most part, because I lead discussion-based classes, tried to moderate the discussion in as respectful a way as possible. And this student came to me towards the end of the semester to talk about his final paper and shared with me that he appreciated that I didn't try and squash down his opinions, right? I personally didn't say to him, like, those opinions are inappropriate. What I did say is, can you back up your sources? You're making a certain claim. Can you support the claims that you're making? And that he thought I was being fair, because that is a fair thing to say, right? If you're going to make a claim, you should be able to back it up. And that's what I said, and that's what his fellow students said. But what he didn't feel is that he was being targeted based on his political beliefs. What he did realize is that he was being challenged on the scholarship. One of the things he said is, I don't understand why Black people don't value education the way that white people do, which is a very provocative statement to make. And so what his fellow students wanted to know is, where is his evidence for this claim? It wasn't in the scholarship we were reading. It wasn't in the literature I was assigning. This was something that he had gleaned. And then there were many students who challenged him. And that's as it should be. There should be a free exchange of ideas and discourse in the classroom. I believe he continued to be a conservative student. And I believe that my class tried to treat him as fairly as possible. So the idea that conservative students are somehow being run out of classrooms has certainly not been my experience.
What action do you think universities should be taking to help address some of these concerns that college campuses are more left-leaning or that they do censor certain conservative voices?
I guess one thing is I have a healthy suspicion about this rhetoric. So in other words, if a student genuinely feels that their voice is being squashed because they're in the minority, no matter what minority or vulnerable position that is, that's something to take really seriously. But if somebody from the outside is saying, and this happened in North Carolina, the Republican-led legislature in North Carolina said, why should we be giving more money to UNC Chapel Hill, which is the flagship school of the UNC system, when they're churning out Democratic voters? If UNC is churning out Democratic voters, we shouldn't be supporting the educational mission of the flagship school. That to me seems extraordinarily partisan, to say we're not going to support the educational mission of a Research One school with an international reputation because they seem to be graduating students who are going to vote a certain way. What I think we should be thinking about is, what is the best education we can have students, we can give to students? How can we best prepare students, no matter where they're from, to be the best critical thinkers and to go out in the world to solve the many problems that our world has? That's really what we should be thinking about. We should be thinking about, what is the larger goal of higher education? The larger goal of higher education should be, how can we teach students in the best way possible from the experts that we have? And how can we best equip students to be fully functioning adults who can tackle some of the world's most thorny social, political, and environmental and economic problems? That's what I'm interested in doing. I'm not particularly interested in trying to assuage any politician or help a politician get elected, no matter what platform they have. I am very invested in wanting to give the students who enter my classroom the best possible teaching experience that I can give them by preparing them to be the best critical thinkers that they can be.
Okay, Professor Ho, I've asked my questions. Is there a final message that you have for listeners?
Yeah, I think everyone should have a healthy sense of skepticism about these debates, because they're really at the heart of what people are hearing about critical race theory. It's electoral political machinations. So in other words, do some historical reading, like look at the McCarthy era and the Red Scare, because that's essentially what's happening. What's happening is a moral panic being created out of thin air. The charge of, I don't want students to feel bad. No teacher wants their students to feel bad. I don't know. Maybe there's some masochist, or sadistic teachers out in the world who have an agenda and they want, is it possible? Sure. There's possible that there's an Asian American high school teacher out there whose mission is to make white students feel bad about themselves, right? Sure. That's possible. Vast majority of teachers do not want that. Right? What we want is we want our students to feel good about themselves, and we want them to feel like they're getting a good education and that they're being seen and heard. I will say that my experience in the K-12 public school system in the United States is that the stories of people who look like me are far and few between. So in other words, I got a pretty thorough history of European American settlers and what that was like. That's fine. But I didn't get any real sense of what it was like to be a Black person in America, other than hearing that there were enslaved people in the US South. And I got no sense of what it meant to be Mexican American. And the only thing I ever learned about Chinese Americans is that we came here and we helped build the railroads. But I didn't hear anything about what happened to those Chinese people. I learned about that on my own when I went to graduate school and started reading about Asian American history and Asian American stories. And I just think that we should think that we're better, right? If the United States is truly exceptional, then that means that we have to be better than what we think, than what the current rhetoric is saying, what the current political divisiveness is saying. And I guess I would just say, I think that people should try and have an open mind. And if you're really interested in reading critical race theory, go out and read critical race theory. It's really dense and complicated, but it's definitely out there. And I would invite people to pick up Ian Haney Lopez's White by Law. It's a fantastic book. And I think it should really be required reading for everyone.
Well, if someone wants to learn about you and your work, where can they find you?
Oh, you can Google my name, Jennifer Ho, although there's a very prominent Minnesota housing authority. So you might get her. But if you Google Jennifer Ho, Asian American Studies, you'd probably find me. Or Jennifer Ho, University of Colorado Boulder. Then you're probably going to get to my webpage and you can kind of click on things and, read about what I've done.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Whether you agree or disagree with today's guests, I thank you for joining us with an open mind. If there's a guest or topic you'd like to have on the show, you can message me on all social media platforms through the handle Heal Our Division. Take care and stay kind. We have more in common than that which divides us.